health, I teach family medicine residents, I do OB, and I do hospice. Our community has suffered significant losses over the last 4 years. The first vision of this community event connected with the public media documentary called Speaking Grief was proposed by Steve Mencher in relation to our history of wildfires and natural disasters here in Sonoma County. After speaking to multiple community members, it became clear that our story of grief went far beyond that. Steve listened to these stories and perspectives and was open to a wider and deeper conversation. And here we are. Thanks to the continued support of NorCal Public Media and the New York Life Foundation, here we are with a phenomenal panel on grief that will be moderated by a group of amazing Youth Promotores from Latino Service Providers. The Speaking Grief documentary, which I hope many of you have seen, and if you haven't, you can stream it on speakinggrief.org. It very skillfully explores grief as an individual and a family experience. As a physician and an activist, I've reflected a lot this year on our collective grief, which is much more complex. 2020 has been an unimaginably difficult year in so many ways, and that's on top of the wildfires and the devastation. And again, on top of the setting of institutional and structural violence, of racial injustice, of violations of human rights of our marginalized communities, of very deep and worsening income, food, and housing security here in our community, lack of equitable access to healthcare and education, the deep political divides in our country, and last but definitely not least, COVID, right? With the multiple layers and types of loss that brings. So grief can come in many ways. It can be related to death. It can be related to the loss of anything that's important to us. It can be anticipatory. And as a society, we often do not know how to speak about or heal through grief. And while it is like an inescapable part of being human, we often avoid it. And we disconnect ourselves from our bodies, from our hearts. And so in that disconnectedness with ourselves, we're disconnected from each other. And as we avoid truly feeling and discussing and healing through grief, we struggle in the very human process of growing and healing and becoming. This is true on an individual, but also a community and society level. In 90 minutes, we totally acknowledge that we cannot truly discuss something as deep and profound and personal as grief. And we can acknowledge that this can bring up a lot for all of us. Our panelists include community members and professionals from across our greater community and bring a wealth of experience and perspectives. But we also acknowledge that while many communities are represented tonight, not all are. Not all voices and perspectives are included, and that so much will still remain unexplored and unsaid. But our sincere hope is that this is a starting point, right? An initial discussion offering an idea of the scope of our grief from the personal to the collective, and how we may move forward together as a community in healing through understanding, empathy, and compassion. So before we begin, let's all ground ourselves a little bit. Let's ground ourselves through taking some breaths together and coming together in like a virtual circle, even though we are all separated. So first, let's take a big deep breath in. And as we breathe out, let's release everything that we're bringing with us from the day. As we breathe in, let us come into this space and into this body. And as we breathe out, let us settle into our seats or whatever supports us, feeling our bodies touch the ground and connect us to the earth, which both connects us and sustains us. Let us take a moment to come together in gratitude to the universe, to Mother Earth, to the powers that be for bringing us together tonight. We would like to humbly acknowledge the Pomo and Miwok indigenous lands on which Sonoma County and most of us here occupy. And let us acknowledge that we all come together from a diversity of backgrounds and experiences, identities, cultures, and beliefs. May this be a space that feels safe and inclusive to all of us. And in one big last breath together, let us center ourselves in our hearts as loving, feeling human creatures who are not alone in the experience of grief, but together tonight, open and held in whatever comes up, vulnerable, imperfect, and real. And may we each hold each other virtually in the days and the months and the future that is to come. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I would next like to introduce Stephanie Manieri, the Director of Programs at Latino Service Providers and an amazing organizer who is going to introduce the Youth Promotores who will be moderating our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Fish. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie Manieri. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am the Director of Programs at Latino Service Providers. And I have been working with Dr. Fish and our friend Steve Mencher, formerly from NorCal Public Media, to organize this very important community conversation this evening. And I'm really happy that our Youth Promotores from Latino Service Providers, a group of very passionate individuals in our community, all Latinas in this case, this evening, are joining us to help moderate the conversation that will be taking place. And so they have developed a lot of the questions, most of the questions that you will be hearing this evening. And we will be having some reflections about the conversation toward the end. And with that, I'd like to briefly introduce all of our Youth Promotoras on the screen, and you will see them as they ask their questions. But this evening we have Montse Salas. She is a recent graduate from Sonoma State University and currently works with the city of Santa Rosa and at Sonoma State University. We have Alejandra Garcia. She goes to Cloverdale High School. Ali Soto, who is a student at the Santa Rosa Junior College. Mar Rivas, a student at Santa Rosa High School. Daphne Cruz Rodriguez, a senior at Windsor High School, and Cristina Palacios, also a senior at Santa Rosa High School. So we're very excited that they will be moderating this conversation. And with that, I pass it back to you, Dr. Fish.
And I think Ali is going to be the one to open up the panel and ask the first question.
Hello. So my first question to all is, grief is a strong emotional word for loss. How do you define grief, and what is loss to you?
And I think we can start with Socorro.
Good afternoon. My name is Socorro Diaz. I am a member of ALMAS in the county of Sonoma. For me personally, it's a mixture of emotions that probably I cannot explain it until you feel it. Personally, to feel so many emotions is as if wanting to be frozen and not be able to be numb. It's like anger, sadness, feeling like you want to cry and not want to look or feel, not being there, not wanting to be there, or you don't want to feel or see. It is something that I felt in this time of pandemic. I can define it as something awful. But at the same time, I can say that it's something that is within me that I have to explore and I have to come out of there. It's as if wanting to be in a dark room and not being able to get out.
And then Dr. Valvodinos, would you go next, please?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great question. You know, I think for me, grief and loss are both individual and shared processes. And what I mean by that, and interestingly, grief, you know, in Latin terms, is the word is gravis, which means to sort of weigh down, and we can interpret that as pain and any number of different feelings, and which is oftentimes how a lot of people experience grief and loss. But you know, feelings are emotions, and you know, as challenging and as heavy as they can feel, oftentimes. Feelings and emotions, including grief and loss, they elicit insights. You know, we learn something from these experiences, as painful as they can be. And you know, the interesting piece that I see quite often, and I experience it myself, is that these insights often elicit a process which is driven by what we learn from these, you know, experiences. And you know, those are opportunities for growth. And oftentimes, as difficult and as challenging as these experiences feel, and as heavy as grief is, when we look back and we've gone through these experiences, you know, I think that there's often a lot of learning that takes place and a lot of growth that takes place. And I take, you know, real value in that. As challenging as it can feel, oftentimes it, you know, we come out on the other end growing from what we've been through.
And then for the panelists, I'm sorry, I actually forgot the step to have you introduce yourselves. So when you answer this question, if you would go and if you would just give a brief introduction to who you are as well and incorporate that into your answer. Dr. Valvodinos, would you like to just give a 2-second on that?
Yeah, I'm Michael Valvodinos. I'm a clinical psychologist here in Sonoma County. And I work at Santa Rosa Community Health. I'm on the faculty at the Santa Rosa Family Medicine Residency here, where I teach in behavioral medicine. And I have born and raised here in Sonoma County in Santa Rosa, grew up in Guerneville, and I spent quite a bit of time in the community trying to learn more from our communities, our Latinx and Indigenous communities specifically, and also provide you know, whatever services I can on a voluntary basis. And so it's a really shared experience that I like to do with you know, out in our community.
Thank you. And Socorro, I'm sorry, I had forgotten to have you introduce yourself. Would you like to introduce yourself? And then we'll go on with the original question.
Soy Socorro Diaz.
My name is Socorro Diaz. I am a leader member of ALMAS. It's Alliance of Active Women, and in the Labor Center in Sonoma County. I've been for 18 years in this area. I am from Oaxaca, Mexico, and that is what I can share about myself.
Thank you so much, Socorro. Reverend Lindsey Bell-Kerr, would you like to introduce yourself and then answer that first question, please?
Sure. My name is Lindsey. My pronouns are they and them. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and I've served here in Santa Rosa for almost 8 years. Prior to becoming a pastor, I've worked in homeless services, still work with unsheltered folks here in Santa Rosa. I work with those who are struggling with addiction and recovery. I've also worked as an organizer and a journalist. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you. Dr. Valvodinos, unfortunately, I was also going to go back and look at the Latin root, and I wanted to be the first nerd on the panel, but the doctor beat me to it, which is great. because I love the way we're juxtaposing both burden and loss. I'll just share an image from an explanation of this. One of my jobs when I was working when I was in school was I was a caregiver with IHSS California. So I provided in-home caregiving. And at the beginning of the day, my client had most of her strength. And so we did a lot of the hard work together. As the day went longer, she would get tired. And so helping her move around, there was more and more like literal weight that I was having to help lift. I too was getting more and more tired as the day went on. And so by the end of the day, a task that was relatively easy in the morning, like getting her on and off the toilet, became really difficult by the end of the day. For me, that's what grief is that we have this additional burden that we're carrying and we ourselves are depleted. So if you're struggling with a loss of something, either a person or part of your own identity or whatever it is, you're feeling the weight of that loss, and simultaneously you don't feel like you have all the resources you once had to cope with that loss. So grief is exhausting. That I think is something that's perhaps the most important thing to remember, is how tired and weary grief can make us.
Thank you so much. Chantavy, would you like to go next?
Hi everybody, I am Chantavy. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the founder of Love and Light in Sonoma County, an activist group here in the community. I am born and raised in Sonoma County, actually born in a home on Santa Rosa Avenue. And I am first generation American Cambodian. My mother is a refugee from Cambodia. And how I would like to answer the first question. Grief in itself is a checkpoint. It never really has any boundaries. And it's the moment where you find yourself and also get lost within yourself. And for me, I define grief as an imbalance in how you go through life with this monotony and this routine, and you forget that you have to breathe, and you have to honor the moments in which you've lived, whether it's your ancestors or now, but it's a checkpoint for feeling. And I think for myself, a lot of times we get into these motions and we forget that you're living. Whether it be during this pandemic where we are dealing with an imbalance in our daily routine. And if you are a parent, the grief of your identity is real right now, because you don't have the normal schedule or the routine, whether it is in, systemic grief. Like for me, being passed down grief from my mother, who was a refugee and survived the killing fields, that affected me in the future. And so for me, it's really that checkpoint where you're having a nightmare and you wake up and you just take that deep breath. And you don't really know where the outcome is, but grief is constantly sitting on your shoulder. And it's how you handle it and how you carry it. And it is that heaviness that Lindsey and Michael have described, but like Michael said, it's very much also a light into reality.
Thank you so much, Tabby, for your perspective. I think Profesora Larque, you're next.
Buenas tardes, les
Good
quiero.
afternoon. I want to thank you for having invited me to this panel. I would prefer to speak Spanish. It's my mother tongue. Everybody was introducing themselves. My pronouns are she and hers. I came to this country in 1980. I came with a career. Here I studied a different career, and now I am a history professor in Santa Rosa Junior College. I teach ethnics, Chicano history, Mexican history, Latino history, and of course, citizenship classes. My previous panelists spoke in a very profound way. I was thinking, what is grief? And grief, for me, is very complex, cannot be defined with words, but with feelings. It is a feeling very individual, very lonely many times. Octavio Paz says that we go through many phases in our lives and they're very lonely. The first one is when we are born, we're born alone. And when we die, we also die alone. So grief maybe can be collective, as Chantavy was saying, what happened to her country in Cambodia with the massacre, with the genocide in the 60s and 70s. You have this collective grief, but at the same time, you have this individual grief. And when we identify with other people, with what is going on, going back to what Dr. Jenny Fish was saying, loss is not only loss of a loved one. We can lose our home, we can lose friends, we can lose things. And sometimes that can be something, you can say, oh, it was just a house. That house, that home has our memories, our photos, our mementos, and that is worth a lot. It's a huge loss. And to be able to start to feel it, we have to internalize it first. Once you internalize it, you can start to feel your pain, because it's a very deep pain. That's when you can start processing the feeling, the talking about it, to carrying out, to processing everything that is going on with you. Like Socorro was saying, it's not an individual feeling, it's not a single feeling, it's a river with a very strong current, with turbulent waters. Sometimes they're calm, sometimes they're turbulent, but it really depends how you navigate that river to feel that pain that I'm feeling. Recently, October 20th, my eldest sister passed. And for us, it was a huge loss, because the family is still suffering in a great way. And even though as a family we're feeling it, each one of us is going through the grief that everybody talked about. And when I hear the word grief, I always imagine a grief like the old-fashioned way. It's a pun. In the word duel and grief in Spanish is the same word. You know, when they duel with two guns. But yes, there is death. There is death. There is not only human death, but there's death of other things. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professora. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Cherise Thompson, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Dr. Thompson, or just Cherise, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am one of the resident physicians at Santa Rosa Community Health and at Sutter Santa Rosa Hospital. I was born in Miami. My family is Jamaican. My parents are immigrants from Jamaica. Spent most of my life in both Florida, South Florida, Central Florida, and right outside DC. I trained in inner city Baltimore, and I've been here in Sonoma County now for about 1.5 years. And that's me. It's so hard to define grief. But if it comes down to it, if I had to pick a word that related to it, it'd probably be pain. It could be grieving a loss. It could be anticipating the loss of something, anticipating something that causes this visceral pain. For myself, for others, I've seen grief manifest in so many ways. I've seen it manifest in, people coming to the doctor's office with symptoms concerning for maybe a heart attack, but it's actually just, that actual pain that's weighing down on them. Oh goodness. Even just now, I'm just thinking about the grief of the loss of so many things in COVID, the loss of not just family members, but loss of time, loss of togetherness, loss of being, loss of traditions. It goes beyond the physical. Yeah, I feel like I could say more, but I think that's it. It's just pain that in some ways, in most ways, ends up turning into trauma of some sort when it comes down to it.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone that has given responses thus far. And for the next question, it is for Reverend Lindsey Bell-Kerr, and I'd like to ask you, why is it important that one speaks and acknowledges grief?
Thank you. So when we spoke about this question earlier, Professor Larque spoke really well about this juxtaposition of words and feelings, which I very much appreciate. And that reminded me and sort of got me thinking about how at the very best, giving words to something is a way of understanding what the feelings are. So in my tradition, which is a Judeo-Christian tradition, giving something a name is how you develop relationship with it. That's true in lots of other cultures too. The first thing we often do when we meet someone is we exchange names, right? That's how we start a relationship. Being able to name what your grief is how you start a relationship with your grief. It's a really flawed Western construct that grief is something that is like resolved and completed, like it's like a problem that's solved. You can blame that on the Enlightenment, I think. This idea that we have problems and then we get a solution. That's not how grief works. Grief is something that stays with you your whole life. 4 years ago, my maternal grandmother died, and I grieved. She wasn't a member of my immediate family. She's the person who made me who I am. And I grieved her for months and months. Lost weight, gained weight, slept too much, didn't sleep, all the things you do, right? Then I think, okay, I'm through my 6 months. I've grieved my grandmother, book closed. Like the next year, my dog died and I grieved my grandmother all over again. That's not a rational thing, that's a feeling thing. Every time we experience a grief, it adds up over time. So being able to name it, right? To say, okay, I am feeling really sad about my dog, but oh, okay, this grief is actually deeper than that. This is my grief for my grandmother. That allows me to have a different relationship with it, right? To not feel bad or feel weird about how sad I feel, but to be able to do the things I know that walk me through that grief. So call my brother, call other people who knew my grandmother, right? Talk about her, name her. And then I can kind of work through that grief on my own. The other piece that's important about speaking and acknowledging our grief is that we live in a world in which we interact with people who have very different backgrounds and cultures from us. And different people interact with grief differently. So if I'm needing support from a friend or from someone, even maybe someone who doesn't know me quite as well, I might really have to be able to name what my grief is in order for other people to see that grief and be able to meet me there. I'll speak just from my own context. That's especially true for people in the LGBTQ community and for other groups of people who may be estranged from birth families for whatever reason, right? We build different relationships based on what our experience is of our own birth community, and so our friends might not know, like, well, as a queer person, right? If your roommate dies, that might be your closest family. So being able to name the weight of that grief allows others the opportunity to actually show up and be supportive and be a comfort to you. That doesn't mean other people always show up in the ways they should, but it does at least give them an opportunity to try to be there for you.
Thank you for your response. And now I'd like to ask our next panelist, Chantavy, why is it important that one speaks and acknowledges grief?
There's so many answers to that. I think feeling grief is more important than speaking grief sometimes. For myself, it's allowing yourself to understand and acknowledge it on a personal level and internally before you share that with someone, because sometimes that relationship with grief is something that you will only understand because of the connection you have, whether it be with someone, something, someplace. It's a shift in yourself, right? So acknowledging the grief, sitting with it, having coffee with it, crying with it, listening to a Nina Simone song and screaming in your car as you're driving on that one-lane road, right? And then you realize that you have community and you're not alone. And for me, being an activist, and I'll bring it back to our little brother, and I say our little brother, Andy Lopez. When our community lost Andy Lopez, we collaboratively felt so much pain. And I grew up in the Roseland neighborhood. And for me, like I said in my first statement, grief has no boundaries. And to digest it, it's asking so much, and it never goes away. For us to communicate it is not easy. For us to feel it by looking at each other and understanding and bringing acknowledgement collaboratively is where the healing for me begins. On a personal level with Andy Lopez and the Black Lives Matter movement, we understand that we have to acknowledge the community in which we live in order for us to move forward together. And it's about doing and feeling, like, to feel empathy, to share empathy, to grieve together provides you that family unit. And for myself, not having a strong family unit, speaking about it brings in all those empaths. And we share that collaborative mindset, that collective unit, so that we can heal, not at the same pace, but that we can acknowledge that we are together and that you are not alone, and that there is power behind grief because there's just no boundaries. It's like love. Love has no bounds, right? So grief in itself has no bounds, and we are going to continuously grieve, but that doesn't mean there's no hope to it. There's no life. And life never ends, y'all. Like, this is part of speaking our truth and speaking our community's truth. And for me, it's really about acknowledging understanding, listening, being with it, sitting with it, whether it be personal or external.
Thank you so much to the two panelists who were able to answer that question. And so the next question is, what are some current losses, loss in not just in terms of death, that you have seen in the community? And this is directed for Socorro.
Adelante, señora Socorro. Hello, good afternoon. I'm Socorro. Currently, well, the losses that have happened in my community, also at personal level, it's been death, losing a loved one, the loss of a friend, of a son or daughter or family member. I'd like to share part of my personal experience with you. All this that's been happening here through now, I've been trying to deal with the situation for myself, because during this pandemic, everything happened so quickly that my pregnancy, it happened why it happened. I'm so happy I'm gonna have a child. This is great. Everybody's happy. The whole family's happy. And I started feeling a lot of stress. I was very frustrated. I was very afraid. I had a lot of anxiety. And then the third month, I lost my baby. And then I felt all these other emotions after that loss. And it's like getting these phone calls from family members. I'm in bad shape. I don't want to leave the room. I have a family member in the hospital. I don't know if he or she will be okay the next day. What's going to happen? For me, I've really tried to use what's available to me in the universe, what I have, to get out of this situation, to deal with it. There are so many things that had me analyze certain things and get to that place. Why did this happen? I kept on asking, and I understand that at that time I was an activist in this process of about getting I was getting some legislature approved as domestic workers, and I was so stressed out during this situation because I had to be working so much, and I wanted to really get something done. I wanted to get something done that's good not only for me, but millions and millions of women who are in this country doing this work, this very hard work. So then this process happened, and then I started realizing that one day suddenly I'm realizing that I don't want to live. I don't want to feel part of. I was isolated really from the life that I have. I started looking for help, reaching out, because it's something terrible. I can tell you that I was talking about that earlier. You know, I really can't explain this loss with words. You feel it really, but it exists. It does exist. It's such a terrible thing for me. You know, I had there's a before and after in my personal life, I'd like to say. And you know, there was a time that I accepted it, that I accepted that there was perhaps not the right moment for my baby to come to this planet, and I started letting it go little by little. But I was feeling like something, part of my being was gone, was going, was leaving. It was this pain. It was this pain that's impossible to explain. So then when I got to this place, I started thinking about what I did have and what could come possibly in the future, and to see my children who are with me. And I told them, I don't know what has happened, what happened like this, why did it have to be like that? But I was able to go ahead to forge on, and then I started getting phone calls from family members telling me about others they've lost, and family members have died because of this pandemic. And I felt really helpless because I wasn't able to help. I just wanted to send them just some love, some positive energy. That's all I can do to help them, but I can't really do that much for my community. It was something that I feel that it's been too much. It's been too much this year for me and for many other people as well who've gone through the same process that I had to go through in this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Socorro, for that response. I'm sending you a virtual hug, and I really enjoyed hearing your personal story. Professor Larque, if you can answer the same question, I'll just repeat it. What are some current losses, loss not just in terms of death, that you have seen in our community?
Vivimos en un país y en
We
una
live in a country and in a society in which historically we had social inequality, ethical inequality, class inequality, and a gender inequality, huge inequalities. And unfortunately, with this pandemic, this difference has become even clearer. When it started here in the US, I had already heard it on the radio, Mexican radio stations since January. And unfortunately, the so-called government that we have here was paralyzed because we prove that the people in the White House right now, they don't care the lives of the people suffering from the pandemic. I immediately started calling it the rich people disease in which the poor people die. The only people that can afford to travel to China is the rich people. They brought it to our countries, but they have many doctors, many cooks, a lot of everything, a lot of abundance, and they can deal with the disease. Meanwhile, the working class does not have those resources. We have all been offended. My nephew in Cancun died in April because of the pandemic, because of COVID-19. And we were very hurt to not be able to be with my brother, not being able to be with him. But we know a lot of people that have passed away as a result of the pandemic. There has been a lot of loss in our communities, loss of employment, a loss of homes, and the fear that we all have, the uncertainty of the future. What Socorro was saying, it comes to a point where each one of us, we're internalizing fear, the fear of dying. Will it be me? Will it be my daughter? Will it be my sister? So we are all in this trance. We don't know how we're gonna come out or when we're going to come out of this collective trance that affects us in many different ways. In a collective way, it affects us in an individual fashion. I was talking to a coworker a couple weeks ago, and we were talking. Everybody's upset. Oh, Mexicans, they're not being careful. Mexicans have the higher index for diseases, and we gotta stop and reflect on that situation. It's not that the Mexicans want to be sick. It's not that the Mexicans are being careless, but we're talking about the poorest classes that unfortunately that goes coupled with their race. These are the people that have to come out, go out and work every day because they don't have the privilege of not working. They cannot afford to not work. And unfortunately, this is my very personal opinion, historically, BIPOCs, European Americans, since they got to this continent, the indigenous, Black, Asians have been told that our life is worthless. There was a genocide of millions, not only indigenous people, African people, a genocide that we have still not been able to recover. We don't even speak openly about this, the millions of people that have died in less than 300 years. So that ideology of racism is deeply embedded in indigenous, Black, mixed folk. Our life is worthless. Not the worth Tom Hanks has a different value. I remember when the pandemic started, everybody was very sad because Tom Hanks got COVID, got the virus. And of course, I was sad too because he's a human life. But how many times we have read in the papers that Marcos Sanchez got the virus and his whole family got the virus too because they could not afford to stop working. So that lack of value that we give to people of color, that makes it even more, we internalize it ourselves. And that is a huge loss. Maybe we won't be able to recover in a long time from this. How many times have we heard about the problem, the potato famine in Ireland in the 1800s? People still do not recover from that because millions died. How many people will die and will lose everything because of what they're going through? And we're not going to even acknowledge it. We are going to acknowledge. But the government, will they acknowledge it? The people in power, will they acknowledge it? No. That is why we have to become a stronger community to support each other. Instead of criticizing the mother that has to go to the store with her kids, why doesn't she leave them at home? Because she doesn't have a babysitter. And our cultural tradition is that when we go out with everyone. We don't know what can happen, especially people that are monolinguals, that don't speak English. So I believe a panel like this one, they're very good, and to be broadcast so we can start to attract people from our own community, because the help is not going to come from outside. The government has absolutely no interest in us. The government has interest in rich people, in the upper classes, in the privileged, in the Anglo-Saxon privileged people, but not in minority folk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Larque, for your insight on this question. And so the question again will be directed to Dr. Thompson, and that question, I'll just repeat it again. It's what are some current losses, loss just not in terms of death, that you have seen in the community?
Thank you. So I mentioned some of them before, but you know, loss of being, loss of, you know, what defines you. What is it that we did before all of this that defined you, that made you happy, that brought you internal joy that you didn't even realize did, but when it was gone, you're like, how do I fill this void? It just only emphasized or exacerbated any kind of depression, or just brought on any kind of depression from just that loss of being, from engaging in whatever you would engage in, that just made you feel like who you are, that defined you. Loss of companionship. Gosh, I think a lot of this I'm actually relating to myself, which I struggle with too. I mean, as someone that, you know, moved out here by myself, I live by myself, and I depend on the companionship of my own friends that I've made here, and knowing that I can't see them, you know, for their own well-being, for my own well-being, just that increase in isolation, that increase in loneliness, patients of my own that maybe will talk with each other every 2 to 4 weeks because they're so lonely, because they can't go out, you know, they're so isolated. I also mentioned the loss of tradition, thinking about the holiday season, families not being able to get together, not being able to have that full celebration together, that loss of tradition that may happen, you know, later on this month. I also bring up myself because I never missed a Christmas with my own family, and I'm gonna have to, and that's just how it is. Loss of trust, trusting one another, trusting, I mean, I don't think we ever trusted our system in all honesty, but, you know, trusting it even less. Oh gosh, loss in any kind of health equity we actually gained over how many years. Oh, it's just so crazy. I mean, the things that we've seen that we know have already been present, and then watching it all being exacerbated by this whole pandemic, it's just, gosh, it's just heartbreaking. It's just loss of living, loss of all of that, I would say, I've noticed within our community.
Thank you for sharing. This next question is for Professora Larque. How do Indigenous people mourn their people transitioning into the spirit world? And what is that process? How do we keep those traditions alive?
Bueno, no soy doctora.
Well, I'm not a doctor. I'm just Laura. I'm just Laura. It's very interesting, that question that you're asking. Quite interesting indeed. It's been many decades in my case that I've been practicing these indigenous traditions. It's not really a recipe that one could give you. You have to do A, B, C to feel better. That's not how it works. And all of us will have a different way of trying to start to process our loss, the people that we love, or what the things that we have lost. Our ancestors had a process of looking at death a different way than we do now in different parts of the world, or as many people see it. There is no such thing as death per se. It's a transition. It's a transition. The person that finishes his or her life in this dimension, he or she does the transition to go to the world of the spirits. And that's a process that we have to leave our everyday life behind, and we have to focus on helping that person that's going through that transition, as painful as it may be, because we know and we think that there is life after life, and that is manifested in many ways. I've spent decades studying this issue about our ancestors, the Mexicas. You know them as the Aztecs, as they're commonly known. And when the person is going through this transition, it's a process in which the spirit goes away, floats away from the body. It's not just one or the other. It happens in a double way, so to speak. It's a double transition. The transition happens towards the spirit, but the body, really, the body does not end either. You could be cremated, you could be buried. We will still give Mother Earth something back. We will give Mother Earth something back, life back, so there can be more life from us. So that's something that's very comforting for us, knowing that that person will not leave, will not be gone, but rather that that person has all these seeds that he or she left. It doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. It's not just the women who can have seeds leaving behind because they can have children. Men also leave needs behind, and men and boys also, their memories, their character, their personality, their teachings. So for us, the spirit takes 40 days to go to the spirit world. And I will talk about what I do personally. I can't suppose that every indigenous person does it the same way that I do, but personally, when my sister died on October 20th, I put the altar up for her for 40 days, and I left it up for 40 days, and I took care of it. It had water that for her dog, it had food. I would give her the offerings of things that she liked to drink. She liked to smoke, so I put the cigarettes there for her. After the 40 days, then my daughter, my nephew, and I, we picked it up. We removed the cross. We had a cross that was made out of flowers, but not the Christian cross, but it was the 4 cardinal points cross of the Mother Earth, of the universe, that we have our the legs, the arms, the chest, the head, everything is connected to us. And we started picking it up little by little. We were praying, remembering everything that she gave us, all the teachings that she left behind. and we planted a plant to remember all of this, because the person doesn't leave, the person doesn't go. The material aspects are what's gone. It's the spirit, the spirits, the memories are still there, and that's what helps us to keep on living. So when we think about the Day of the Dead, what the Spaniards gave us only 2 days for that, our ancestors had months and months of celebration for this. The celebrations would start in August and would finish in the middle of November, and every sex or gender, young, old people would have their 1 month or their weeks assigned to them to celebrate. So we, with my family, would put up an altar to the 4 cardinal points for where the old people go, where the women go, where children go, men go, etc. And we all participate in this. It's intergenerational. It's me, I'm the oldest one here in my family in the United States, all the way down to my little nephew who's 10 years old. And we're trying to teach him all these traditions, how to burn the incense and the herbs, to also have this respect that we need for our ancestors and for our spirits. It's a process that I enjoy very much because it helps us. It helps us to start healing the pain. And this civilization here in the United States, on the other hand, we think that reading a book will help us, or that going shopping will help us. And this society is very individualistic. We think that we have to, we have to like suck it up. We have to suck up this pain, like we say, when really this process of grieving is a community thing. It's a community effort, a family effort. There's a reason we do this for a certain amount of time, because it's a time we need to really process, the pain. So that's how my ancestors think about this, and that's how I think about it. So thank you very much.
Of course, thank you for sharing, Professora. I'm glad you're able to keep your traditions alive today. This next question is for Dr. Valvodinos. We know that grief is a part of life. How do we prepare and accept grief into our life, even though it is painful?
Yeah, thanks for that, Maritza. Well, I think it's again, like so many folks have said, it's a question that I think has multiple different answers, and I think can also be unique to the person answering the question and their experience of, or their maybe their practices and customs and beliefs around this process of grief. But I think I want to acknowledge that for many, grieving their loss right now, many grieving their loss of freedom or their ability to connect with other people in ways that are meaningful to them, I think is especially poignant. I think right now a lot of people are going through that process because of COVID. I also want to acknowledge that for some of us, there may be a distinction between this idea of a primary loss or secondary loss, which are both equally heavy, right? So for example, like a primary loss, we typically tend to think about like major life events such as the death or the passing of somebody or loved one or losing a job. Whereas I think for a lot of people, and COVID-19 is sort of a good example, and I feel this myself, is that, COVID-19 has led to lots of different types of secondary losses and grief, such as losing, relationships or, recreation, the freedoms that we had, our social supports in a way that's isn't, virtually, really grieving what isn't or what wasn't, or the grief from the privileges that really exist for some and not for others. And I think it's just important to kind of name that there's different processes happen even when we're talking about these ideas of grief and loss. But I'll share with you some ways that to cope and grief that I'll find helpful. And I'm sure, like I said, that this is not a cookie cutter approach, and there's multiple different ways in terms of approaching this question around how do we grieve in this sort of really particular, odd, and unfortunate time in our lives. And I think the first thing that I think is really important is identifying grief and not avoiding it. I think it's it's human nature when we feel something that brings us anxiety, brings us pain, feels uncomfortable, that we want to kind of push away, right? Because it helps us temporarily feel better. But I think it's important, like so many folks have said already today, is that this is a process. And this is an important process. And there's an experience in this process that I think is cathartic and important for us to deal with. And we need to give ourselves a little bit of time and space to mourn and to grieve. Oftentimes people say, I hope you feel better fast, or, oh, you're strong, you'll get over this. And, there's almost this unspoken expectation that in short time we'll get through this or past this. I think that that's not respectful of, how people mourn and grieve and experience loss and how long it takes. Some folks it may take shorter, some may take longer. We all have different capacities for this, all have different resiliency levels, and that's okay. Right now, there's a really wonderful opportunity to connect virtually. Obviously, we're probably all sick of that. But again, it's an opportunity for us still to remain connected in the midst of what feels very disconnecting. And I think, it's important to remain mindful that as we sort of slog through our daily lives of technology, for those of us who have that privilege, I think it's also important to remember that it's also a tool to connect outside of those discomforts of work and all the other sort of annoyances of technology. It's still a method to remain connected. Meditation and reflection, I know that that's a word that's often thrown around a lot and it's used. Jenny gave a fantastic, Dr. Fish gave a fantastic example of how just to do that. But these are really important ways that we can start eliciting meaning after a loss. There's ways to reflect and to sit and sort of ground ourselves. Interestingly enough, the way that I like to describe this, because for some people it can feel kind of like a fuzzy, confusing term. It's just the process about thinking about our own thinking, right? When you just stop and you think about your thinking process without, judging what you're doing or how you're doing it and whether you're doing it right or wrong. It's just that process of trying to stay grounded for a little bit, shutting off all the noise as much as possible, and really think about your thinking. That can facilitate this process of meaning making in relationship to grief and loss. We've talked a lot about faith, and we're not always talking about faith in the concept of religious faith. It could be faith in our own resilience, faith in a connection to our community. I think however you tend to think about faith, it's important to remember that faith is important in this process. And I think, the last thing I want to say is that grief and loss can be very isolating, right, and disconnected in and of themselves. I think that a lot of people experience it that way. I certainly do. It's important, I think, to see loss and grief as a sort of universal experience, right? We all, at some point or another, go through these processes in our lives, and we each may deal with it differently. But I think we aren't alone in this feeling, which I think is really important to remember. And I think just to reflect on that is often a really, really helpful strategy, because again, when we're in this experience, it can feel incredibly isolating, incredibly lonely. But more likely than not, there's probably millions of people around the world that are also experiencing this, and it's important to remember that we're just not alone in this process.
Thank you. I'd also like to ask the same question to Professora Larque. I'll repeat it. We know that of life, how do we prepare and accept grief into our life even though it is painful?
Well, we don't welcome pain because pain is not welcome, but we learn to accept it. We learn to see what we can do. Like Dr. Valvodinos was saying, I agree with him. I was reflecting what is important when we are going through a harsh moment individually or in a community, to turn off, to shut down everything, to have silence around us, to be able to feel what we're going through. I don't want to repeat what Dr. Valvodinos says. I agree with him a lot, but it is very important to acknowledge that we are going through a tough time, and instead of going to the bar well, we couldn't go to the bar even if we wanted to. Instead of drinking alcohol to forget, why don't we, like Dr. Thompson was saying, or Reverend Lindsey, call someone, talk to someone that we trust. Many times it is not necessary to talk to our blood relatives. We always say that our family, our blood relatives is one, but our family is a different one. Sometimes our family, our extended family, is the people that give us the support that we truly need when we are going through a hard moment. Not only death, but also as a community, we feel dispersed. People are dispersed. We don't know what to do. We're isolated, and it's a big pain. We have this method of being able to do a video call on the computer. We can call them on the phone, and that helps us a lot to start to accept what we're going through and find a remedy. I don't remember who said it. I think it was Socorro. The grief from pain, the grief from a loss, you never forget about those, but we learn to live with them. And we start to look for a new day. We start to see the sunrise. We start to see things in a more positive light. And we move on with the process and we make do with what we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all the points that were made along this conversation. I'm sure they're very large points that will be brought up in future conversations. But now I have a question for Reverend Lindsey Bell-Kerr. How do we avoid minimizing grief? What do we not say while still remaining positive?
Yeah, I shared with Dr. Fish that I really loved this question, and I have so appreciated the youth leadership in this because this question feels very honest to me. If we were waiting till the moment that we knew the perfect thing to say to someone in their grief, we would never speak. But this idea of just like, okay, like what should we not say? Like that seems very much more manageable. Speaking from my own context as a Christian pastor, I'll say that like Christian theology is probably 98% to blame for the worst things you're not supposed to say when somebody dies. Like, okay, so everything happens for a reason. No, it doesn't. God doesn't give you more than you can handle. One, you shouldn't assume someone believes in God, but even if they do, that's also not true. Like really not true. We also shouldn't assume that somebody's grief is secondary when it might be a primary grief for them, right? So for me, the practice I try to do in not minimizing someone's grief is I try to speak in pretty vague terms at first, just to let them know I'm there. And then I spend a lot of time listening. So instead of saying, I'm really sorry your mom died, that must be really hard for you, I'll start by saying, hi, I heard the news. Do you want to talk about your mom or do you want to talk about anything else? Because sometimes when people are grieving, they don't want to talk about their grief right away. Like somebody's mom could just die, but they want to talk about their cat or ice cream or anything other than their mom, because that's what they have the capacity for right now. So I would say like listening is a good way to do that. The other way we work to not minimize other people's grief is to not minimize our own grief, right? So I really appreciated what Michael named about like strength, like talking about people being strong. This is a colonial mindset from, Europeans did it, like strength above everything else, right? Like that's Pax Roma. vulnerability is what I think we should espouse to in grief rather than strength. So when we're honest about our own grief and how we're struggling, that allows us to see more how other people are struggling. And when we model for other people, like naming our sadness and our grief, then that lets them know, hey, I'm somebody you can tell when you're sad. So yeah, it starts with how we treat ourselves, really, how we, that determines then how we treat others.
So we're going to move into final reflections. And so if we could start with Dr. Thompson.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm someone that's doesn't have a lot of words in general, but are pretty intentional with the few that I have to share. And when it comes down to it, grief in whatever form it manifests, in whatever way we feel, it's okay. It's okay. And to normalize that for each other in whatever way it manifests for us. And to continue to validate each other in however it manifests for us as well. People show grief in different ways. People experience it in different ways, and it may show itself in how we interact with others in different ways, and to just be mindful of that as we interact with each other. To think first with kindness and think first with empathy when it comes to all of this, because this isn't going to get any better, not anytime soon. So if we're just thoughtful and caring of one another, supportive of one another in whatever way that other person needs support, yeah, I think that'll be okay.
Thank you. Now we can move on to Chantavy, if you can please reflect.
Taking a deep breath, yeah, right now. And it's going to be a little bit till we process this conversation, and that's okay. And it's okay to not be okay. Grief in itself is a subject matter that is always the dog that doesn't want to walk. You're going to always drag it. And sometimes it's okay to pick it up. Grief in itself, in this context, is going to be a journey that we choose to walk with. And for myself in particular, it is a process. And for who I am and what I've gone through in my life with grief, I'm always in revision, yeah, and you're never on the final draft of life. You're always going to continuously rewrite it and find clarity. And with grief in our community, and in our community in particular, Sonoma County, I know a question that we haven't touched on that we moved past is resources, and we're here, right? We have this community, and it's about taking that first step to be like, hello, I'm Chantavy and I'm a survivor. And for that in itself is an open dialogue and an open door to create this unity, that conversation is open, and having a safe space, and even sharing our pronouns and who we are is allowing us to open another door. And having a 6-year-old and being a single mother, y'all, I've watched a ton of Mr. Rogers in the last 3 days. And the one in particular that was perfect for today is Mr. Rogers saying, no one can be you but you. No one can be yourself other than yourself. No one can understand your grief other than yourself, but people can empathize and acknowledge it and understand it. So we can continue to move on together, but also internally, it's okay to feel sad, depressed, I cried yesterday. I took my son to Trader Joe's and I cried in an aisle. Because sometimes it just hits you. And you can't pick or choose where you decide to feel. And I really appreciate this conversation because it's another opening, it's another door. Each of us individually have separate doors to open. And in this community, it's great to see faces that you're going to acknowledge and continue to acknowledge each other and learn perspective. And that in itself is healing.
Thank you for these meaningful words. Can we move on to Socorro, if you may add some words, please?
Well, I've been processing everything that I've been listening to. If I can share something that the only medicine, really, the only formula that can really help with this pain, with the suffering, is perhaps is to reflect, to think about what I've lived, what I've learned is that self-awareness, self-life, self-love, love, family love, love that we have for one each other, and to do this step, to be present, to be in the here and now, and to say, yes, I'm here, and not like trying to flee, to run away. Like you have to, to really do it head on, and you have to live through it. For me, that's valid. I think this afternoon you gave me a lot. I really appreciate having been here, I appreciate the opportunity to be a speaker here today and to also feel what I feel, because I really learned a lot from all of you. And yeah, I really needed to be here. This is very important for me. So thank you very much for allowing me to be here this afternoon.
Gracias. If we can move on to Dr. Valvodinos.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about this because I think everyone has said so many important and beautiful things. I will just sort of finish by saying that, we talked a lot, and we talk a lot about grief and loss as parts of life, and sort of this is sort of a normal part of life, and how it feels and how it's experienced. I think everyone did such a wonderful job. Expressing their viewpoints on this. But I think that if we believe that grief and loss are part of living and being human, then it must, I think, also be that we have some fundamental human capacity to deal with grief, and probably most importantly, grow from these experiences. And so I leave folks, and I leave with this faith in that belief. Because as we welcome, I would say, or maybe not welcome, maybe accept that this is a part of being human and living, that there must also be a way in which we deal with this and confront grief and grow from this. And so, that is my sort of reflection.
Thank you. If we can move on to Profesora Larque.
Pues le quiero dar las gracias.
I want to thank Latino Service Providers for having organized this forum. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. I really enjoyed learning from my fellow panelists, everything you talked about, and there was some very interesting reflections here that all of us has talked about, what we feel, what we live in this process of grief. And the beautiful thing about this forum is that there isn't a rule really about how we have to express ourselves on an emotional level. We do it in a collective or in an individual way, but every one of us spoke about how we feel, how we do deal with it, how we process it. And there really isn't, we can't really deny, for example, if somebody is a Christian or Jewish or or follows indigenous traditions, we can't really say that one tradition is more worthy than the other one, or that one is more important or less important than the next one, because anything that we do helps us process pain. That's good. For example, for one person, it could be go for a walk. For another person, it could be just to light a candle, or it could be to go to the ocean or whatever. So all that is valid, is good, and it has to be recognized. And that helps us to keep on working collectively to try to learn how to accept how each and every one of us in our communities or on an individual level processes grief. And that helps us to keep on going. As Dr. Valvodinos says, we have a long history as humans, and we have lost many, many, many lives in the history of our humanity, and it's going to continue that way. We're going to keep on losing lives, and what's important is how do we deal with it. Thank you very much for having invited me here. I learned a lot from all of you. Thank you very much.
Gracias. And last but not least, Reverend Lindsey Bell-Kerr, if you would like to add anything.
No, I think everybody pretty much summed it up well. I guess I would just second Professor Larque's point about attending to grief, right? So what I think I heard her say earlier about not just, going to a bar, or I guess even socially distanced drinking at home, right? Those are ways of suppressing emotions, right? And attending to something means engaging with it, right? So, whatever a faithful practice looks like for you, it could be, a walk, meditation, prayer, candle, whatever. That's something that it involves you engaging with grief in a way that is honoring your sorrow and looking for healing. So I would just commend that, especially in this time of year when it's dark, when we're isolated from each other. Just maybe take that as a question to take home with you. How do I attend to whatever primary or second grief I'm experiencing right now? And then give yourself the space to really do that.
I want to thank each and every one of you for coming together for this conversation. I know that there's so much more to be said, so many more conversations to be had. Reverend Lindsey, we had talked about a closing. I have some kind of final announcements, but I'd really love to close this space together intentionally. If you'd help us with that.
Sure. So I want to invite you to just take a moment, and if you feel comfortable and you can close your eyes, that's fine. If it's better for you to keep your eyes open, that's okay too. I'm going to put my feet on the floor. If your feet don't go to the floor, just maybe touch something that's touching the floor, desk or whatever. I'm going to invite you to breathe in and out. Once more, and out. And that is the same breath that is shared by all living things, by all other people. With each breath you breathe, you are not alone. You are not alone. In joy, you are not alone. In grief. And this breath, like every other breath, is a gift. This breath also makes you a gift. You are the only one like you, and your life is precious. If you remember nothing else in your time of grief, remember that. remind each other of that, of your own preciousness. And so it is with gratitude for this life that we share together, and that we have faith as a community that will pull through any grief before us and come out more connected to one another on the other side. And so it is.
Thank you again. Thank you all so very much for this conversation and my hope for further conversations in the future. A couple things to wrap up. We're going to actually put a survey link in the chat. We'd really love everyone who's attended this to share your thoughts about this forum and any that we may have in the future. We'll also be trying to, so as to not leave everybody hanging as we talk about grief, to bring together some community resources that also got put in the chat. Will be posted on the NorCal Public Media Speaking Grief website. And I just want to speak to two upcoming community events. One is put on through Memorial Hospice, where they have virtual grief support services, both in English and Spanish. And they have one specifically for the grief of child loss, either during pregnancy or in childhood. And that'll be on December 12th. And then Reverend Lindsey and their church will also hold a service called the Blue Christmas, and that will be on December 17th. And so those resources will be posted. Sorry about that. And if you in the community have other resources that you would like to share, please send them our way. We would love there to be kind of a toolkit and resources available for all of us. Many, many, many thanks to Steve Mencher for helping make this possible, and especially to Stephanie Manieri for all of your work, and to all the Youth Promotores. You're all amazing. Without all of you, none of this could have happened. And then obviously to all our panelists again, who responded to our invitations in the last few weeks to come into the space and be vulnerable and share deeply. And yes, that is it. Thank you all so much for being here tonight.